many of you will have questions on both. Thank you very much, Costas. You put a whole number of further questions in our mind about the sort of evolution of some of this work, but also challenges around going to scale and also moving from the whether policy works to why, and therefore how transferable that learning is. I'm going to open it up now for a round of questions, challenges, and so forth, and then we'll get Ariel and Costas perhaps to engage in feeding back. One there, one over the back here, Tim over there. Yep, okay.
Thank you. Phil Sigley, Federation of Cocoa Commerce. There was a discussion about infrastructure, and there were RCTs, which are the random control trials, and the fact I've read elsewhere that the random control trials don't suit measurement of infrastructure, for example. But it does appear that many of these attempts to scale up don't take into account the infrastructure environment within which you're trying to scale up, particularly in rural farming communities. Now, these tend to be a real burden for how the trade, for example, how business can engage in some of these efforts where scaling up could be feasible. But I think the World Bank, to a certain extent, doesn't seem to, I know in your 2008 World Bank report, agriculture featured prominently, and we've been discussing that for many, many years about the role of agriculture. But I think to get to any form of scale, there has to be a more fundamental approach to the infrastructural environment and the provision of infrastructure, where those communities that you talked about, the village councils, etc., they don't appear to feel as though they're confident enough or believe enough in the future without that additional support. And I think more thought needs to be given when you come to scale to look at that infrastructural background and framework within which you expect these smaller projects to develop. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, and if you have a question, can you try and frame it around a question, not just comments?
Okay. Thank you very much. That was a really helpful two presentations. I sort of agree with the philosophical point that it's somewhat illusory to think that you can do these things without any assumptions, without any model. I suppose the big question is there a danger that this becomes the new fad? It crowds out other approaches to evaluation, and that maybe some of the really big things aren't amenable to this kind of quasi-experimental randomised control trial. So macroeconomic policy, trade policy, public financial management, stuff that's hard to, break down and compare a control and an intervention. Is there a danger that, we lose interest in some of the big stuff? I think this critique was made of the faddishness of microeconomic natural experiments, the kind of freakonomics. Somebody wrote an article called Freakonomics Evil Spawn, saying it's really good, but it risks distracting economics from some of the big questions. And is there also, how would you deal with the fact that, as you say, with some of these things, you're trying to get at intergenerational effects. Maybe you can get at enrollment, maybe even you can get at educational outcomes. Can you, how can you trace all of this through to the next generation if you're really trying to use CCTs to break intergenerational transmission of poverty? So type of things you could look at and time frame.
Yeah, okay. To the middle and then over to this side. Right in the front here.
Okay, good evening. Katerina Mitiev, the Hunger Project. Thank you very much for the presentation. Quick question about opportunity cost. Because for me, it's pretty obvious if we compare some intervention, for example, cash transfers, with doing absolutely nothing, we are highly likely to achieve some positive results and reduction in poverty and stuff like that. But how about comparing, cash transfers with bringing some new business to the village, or maybe opening microfinance institution or something like that? So because it seems to me that we kind of doing comparisons within cash transfers if we're giving it to mothers or fathers, but how about other initiatives? What exactly we're evaluating? Thank you.
Okay, fine. There's Caroline and also a gentleman at the background who asked this.
Thanks. Caroline Ashley, independent with the Business Innovation Facility. My question is more about how it was done. Two aspects. One is the level of resources invested in this. People have different views about investing money in generating information for good decision making. or actual service delivery. I'd be really interested to know the broad ratio between the expenditure on this assessment work and the actual service delivery, and if it is at all similar to the broad rules of thumb we have for M&E, of a sort of classic intervention. And secondly, who did it in the sense that were the service delivery staff, the operational staff, the managers involved in this process, or was it entirely independent and separate? And of course there are pros and cons both ways round in terms of the impact of the results that you find.
Very good. Gentleman there in the glasses, and then I'll come to you, and then Anna, and then I'm going to get around, and we'll hopefully have more time.
Hi, Michael O'Donnell from Plan International UK. Two related questions. It was interesting to see that the areas that the World Bank seems to have prioritised are fairly innovative, promising areas. And I'm wondering, is there a higher burden of proof for those sorts of areas where people are trying to prove their concepts? And are we doing enough to evaluate those things where the bulk of the money is going on, perhaps sort of less glamorous or more standard interventions? Second question is, the ultimate test of the effectiveness in translating into policy is the money and the financial flows following the results of the evaluations.
Very good question. Okay, just two more in this round. The gentleman in the centre here, and then Anna over.
Thank you, Andy Rutherford from One World Action. Just like to thank Ariel enormously for introducing some good concepts, humility and a bit of humbleness. I like those enormously. Very refreshing. How is that negotiated? In your example to do with education, as a metaphor, the returns, more people in school, great. Better education results to be examined. And that's the constant challenge, as Alison put the word in our minds, of where the impact and the evaluation of the impact is negotiated to what you're looking at, basically. And I'd be interested to know the political process in the sense of how you negotiate the humility and the humble outcomes for the targets of the impact evaluation, please.
Okay, and finally over there, Anna.
Hello, I'm Anna McCord from the Social Protection Team at ODI. We're currently doing some work with the independent evaluation group of the bank. And there are several other pieces of work that ODI has done over recent years looking at this thorny question of how one actually does assess impact. And so I wanted to thank Ariel enormously for the presentation and the way he's opened up actually this discussion about impacts and outcomes rather than just outputs, because that's really the critical question. The challenge, which I'd be really interested to hear his response to, is that there are many thousands of projects, and actually it's only a small number can actually be evaluated in this way. I mean, a few hundred of those can be evaluated. It's a costly exercise. I mean, obviously doing these kind of things is not possible for every project. But the dilemma that the bank, that DFID, that other donors have, is that most of their projects are evaluated on the basis of log frames or KPIs. I've forgotten KPI now, you have to help me with that. Key performance indicators. And these tend to focus very heavily on outputs rather than outcomes. So my question is to Ariel, what's his dream of how he can mainstream these kind of critical ideas but get them into ongoing evaluation of all projects so we can actually look at outcomes more than outputs? Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Okay, well, there's a host of things. Ariel, do you want to have a first stab at responding to some of those, if you can?
Yeah, and I think many of these are interrelated. And let me start by the end, I guess. Clearly, I think it is not realistic and not even correct to see impact evaluation the way we've defined it as something that you will be using across the board to measure results on an individual project basis. Some other people, including colleagues of mine, may disagree, but I honestly don't think it is feasible. Which opens up two different set of questions. One is, when do you use impact evaluation and how you use it? But two, the question that you raised, and is how do you, on the other hand, avoid a rather mechanistic form of evaluation that focuses only on measuring outputs. On the latter, I think my personal view on this is that if you want to think of a results chain that goes from types of interventions and things that get done, okay, it's not just the inputs, it's more than that. Then a set of intermediate outcomes, which, for example, in our area of work in human development, would typically be linked to service delivery results. Kids in school, perhaps with some measure of quality, not necessarily learning outcomes, but some measure of, say, for example, in case of health, it's not just the kids are being brought to the clinic, but also what is it that the doctor and the nurse does to the kid. And by the way, we're not measuring that. And then you think of final outcomes. Seems to me that the impact evaluation programs that we're talking about try to create the basis for to validate a theory that links particular types of interventions to these intermediate outcomes, to the final outcomes. And so what you try is to validate a theory there. But that won't give you the, that just gives you your framework under which to make decisions. There will always be decisions made under uncertainty. Okay, so in a way, it requires moving from a deterministic model to more of a Bayesian type of approach to project formulation, where you say, look, now with CCTs, I know what I know, and I know what I don't know, and these are based on that, this is the approach that we're following, and I'm building in opportunities to learn about the things that I don't know. But what I clearly need to do is to be able to measure, regardless of whether I'm going to be doing an impact evaluation or not, I definitely need to measure the final outcomes that typically had not been measured before, okay, and monitor those. So I think it's a more complex approach, where the impact evaluation cannot be thought of as I'm going to be doing this for every single project in order to determine whether this project has worked or not, but rather more in a more strategic way. How do I build better knowledge on effective programs and approaches, and as Costas was saying, testing meaningful ideas. They're grounded on, we tend to think on economic theory, but others may think on social theory. Okay, which leads me to the question on how to negotiate outcomes, right? Because I think you're right. It's a negotiation process. I think what I remember asking several years ago, in the previous job I had, before the job dealing with impact evaluation, I was supposed to be was the lead economist for a department, and so I was supposed to provide advice to the upper staff working on projects. And I remember, a very simple question to one of my colleagues working on education projects: how do you actually, when you set up your targets, in that case was a target for attendance or enrollment, on what basis do you do that? How do you define whether the target is a 5% increase, a 10% increase, or a 20% increase? And the answer I got there is, the way I typically do it is I draw a line, I look at the historical data, and I draw a line and I look at how much I can expect to achieve, which to me meant that essentially this person was assuming no impact whatsoever, right? Now, the truth of the matter is that quite often these negotiations that you refer to are done in very non-transparent ways and very evidence-based. Okay, they're done at the last minute, behind closed doors, and just in more or less sophisticated ways. I don't want to prejudge that, but they're not part of a process. I think what we're saying here is what impact evaluation can help us, and it's not going to provide the whole answer to this, is to provide some element of discipline and some frame of reference. So now I feel, for example, when it comes to a CCT program, I can feel much more comfortable saying, you're nuts. This is not going to happen, okay? Because we have that evidence. But it continues being a negotiation process. And the question is whether it's a negotiation process that happens behind closed doors or is a negotiation process that is out in the air and based on this growing evidence. The other point was, so how do these results influence decision making? And we were talking about this before the decision. I am of the idea that actually the influence happens in complex and indirect ways. That when you think of complex organizations, government, the World Bank, it's a little bit unrealistic to think that because you do a study and you show that X thing worked or didn't work, or that then that automatically someone pushes a button and that changes the way things are done. Okay, it doesn't happen that way. It doesn't happen. There's many other factors that influence the decision making. Clearly, evaluations are playing a role, and I think Costas referred to the case of Mexico and the CCTs, etc., and we see this in many other countries. And it's certainly, I see it happening in the World Bank. I see now people asking much more frequently when someone comes up with the last brilliant idea. I see now more frequently people are asking, where's your evidence? And what has been published about this? And that's exactly what we want. It's not a process of automatic change. It's creating more of a culture. It's, again, going back to Primo Levi. And it's not an easy process.
Answer one more, and then we'll just get a few more.
One more. There were questions on how they were done, cost and who did it. Cost, and this is the perennial question, because honestly it varies a lot. The huge cost, the largest cost is data collection. Okay, and data collection, it all depends on obviously unit costs vary across countries, and the more complex. But it's essentially about the size of the service that you're going to be conducting that determines your cost. And the more complex, the more arms to your intervention, the more complex it gets. I don't have a number. I would say that typically if I were to take an average of the things that we are funding. Through sort of my office has sort of a large trust fund that we've been using to support this, and our grants have been between $150,000 and $300,000. But typically, we're not the only source of funding. Okay, so you have some large evaluations that are really expensive, But then there are some others that are more in the couple $100,000. But this is not a cheap enterprise, and that's why you need to be careful. Who does it? Extremely important question. And I think basic point there is to what extent you have, with all due respect to researchers in the UK and in the US, question here is to what extent this is essentially becomes an extractive industry, whereby researchers in rich countries go collect data and then publish papers, or whether this becomes a process of capacity building that strengthens the ability of local researchers to actually do this kind of work. We have put a lot of emphasis on the latter, okay? And I think, and I know that a lot of the good researchers in the north, such as Costas, make a point of partnering with local researchers and do this. We've certainly made this an important aspect of our work, and also developed a whole program of training that goes side by side with the actual evaluations to build that capacity. So I think it's a very important point.
Very good. One question comes to my mind based on that, but I know we've got one online, so we should give voice to all people.
Hi, yes, we have actually a good number of questions online. I'll try and just take two really quickly that you can choose or not to answer. Following on what you were saying before, Ariel, there's a question here that's saying effectively impact evaluation is most effective for influencing future development practice, by which time the environment may have changed given the complexity and multifaceted approach to development or environment. So how can impact evaluation inform current practice? And that was by Shalini from IDRC in Delhi. And there was another one here from Caroline Hyder, Director of the Office of Evaluation at the World Food Programme, commenting on the original presentation, saying, I like the approach of linking up evaluations, a program of evaluation, as the speaker called it, but wonder whether links have been made between the CCT evaluations and the school accountability evaluations, as together they may tell an even more powerful story. And at the risk of really quickly usurping the presenters' or stealing their thunder, I suppose, I should note that it is obviously a very popular subject these days, and the Center for Global Development in DC is currently hosting with 3IE, that's the International Initiative on Impact Evaluation, today, as it so happens, an all-day seminar and workshop on impact evaluation. And 3IE is an initiative that tries to learn across these different impact evaluations. So I encourage you to look at their website, as well as the other information that is provided here at ODI.
Good, great. Very good. I'll reserve my question for later. I think you've got a few more there. Costas, do you want to come in on any of the...
Just one point, I think, which was more directly related to what I said, and I think was partly covered by Ariel. I don't think doing evaluation and randomized controlled trials is a fad. It's a really major step forward in our empirical toolkit. What is a fad is running around and experimenting with minor little tweaks in schools or in whatever, and just going away and writing a paper on some kind of minor incentive that is not clearly related to how you would design policy from that. Of course, there is scope for that as well, but I think the major advance is to have researchers collaborate with policymakers in developing countries and evaluate big ideas within an overall framework of policy design, and thinking through from the beginning how this intervention will help, in what ways, and how it would eventually translate into policy. Just 2 minutes, 1 minute. So, for example, now at IFS with Orazio Attanasio and myself and Sally Grantham McGregor were designing an early childhood development program in Colombia, and the key idea there is to design a program that is afterwards scalable, so kind of use local resources, use local people, see whether we can train them to deliver an early childhood development program. So we're going beyond the kind of, let's call it the clinical idea that it's good to feed and stimulate babies. We kind of know that, but now can we take that to the field and implement it? Now that's the kind, obviously since I'm involved in it, that's the kind of randomized controlled trial and intervention design that I think is much beyond the fad. It's actually taking theory and empirical work into actually designing effective policy.
Terrific. There was a point there made virtually about how effective is impact evaluation in helping to shape kind of current practice, given that the circumstances around which policy interventions are being embedded is constantly moving and changing.
So, two answers to that. One is that you can, in some cases, you can get results in a relatively short period of time. By this I mean, in a couple of years. It depends on sort of when you expect how lucky you are and what kind of effects you're looking for, right? So there are some effects that if you're going to be building infrastructure, you're not going to get the impacts very soon. If you're feeding a child, you can get the effects quite measure the effects soon. And so if you design it quick, right, and you're lucky and everything goes right, then you can get results quick enough to influence the project design. And I think there's lots of stories of how we're doing that. But I think beyond that, I go back to the point about patience. And again, to Primo Levi. And so I still remember when the work on education that was mentioned here was started around 2004, after the World Development Report was released. And I still remember when the bank cafeteria, we sat down with Shanta Devarajan, who finished the report, and at that point he had the job I have today, okay? And we, with a couple other colleagues, and we said, great ideas, Shanta. How are we going to test this? Okay. How do we build the evidence to support these various aspects of the triangle? And we set up a multi-year program to learn that. Okay. And it took us about 5 years to get where we're now, and a group of my colleagues will be writing this major book. Knowledge doesn't come quickly and easily on this. Now, the key question there is to pick right, to decide what is it that you're going to be putting your money into, and you're going to be investing 5 or 6 years of work, okay, to work on. I'm persuaded that focusing on how you improve school accountability is a topic that is not going to go away. Okay, it's essential. It's one of those big questions, and so it was a safe decision to make. And likewise, I'm persuaded that focusing on early childhood development is again a topic that is not going to go away, and is essential, and so it's worth while investing, even though we're not going to get the results we need in a programmatic way for a number of years.
Right. I suppose one of the dangers is always that one finds an intervention works in one way, and then we try and find how it works in many other ways. And of course, conditional cash transfers are being talked about now as potentially a response to crisis. They weren't designed as such, and I think we do need to be very careful about how some of this evidence then gets used to sort of justify ends that were not initially part of the rationale. I think we've had a feast of really good discussion, incredible downloading of a lot of experience and insight. And thank you very much, Ariel and Costas, think we've all learned a great deal. I mean, what I've taken away, a few quick headlines. I mean, perhaps contrary to popular opinion, there's nothing about impact evaluation that's a quick fix. There are some things that can be turned around relatively quickly, but actually this is a patient craft, and we should make sure that we keep that in mind. Important to be selective around the ways in which this suite of methodologies that are used, being strategic around the questions that are being addressed, and also thinking about scaling as part of the initial research design in order to evolve beyond the intervention to potentially policy implications that are of broader relevance. Thank you very much indeed, Ariel. Thank you very much, Costas, and thank you all very much for coming.